I can't hear you. Hang on a second. There we go. Whoa!
Make it bigger. You know how to make it bigger.
Yeah, working that right now.
No, bigger. There is another. No. Yeah, that's right. That's a good one. But we.
How are you, sir?
Oh, we have 2 minutes to start. Yeah, I'm good. And you?
I'm very well. I'm ready for this.
You have to approve my slides. Hold on a second.
I have to approve your slides?
Yeah. You don't...
Got it.
Here you go. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Looking for I don't see him yet, but
yeah. It says processing. Yeah, now you can see them. You have to like.
There we go. At the stage.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Looks like it's going just fine.
Yeah, it's going just fine.
Excellent.
So you know how to click it away. There is a view that says you can clip, so you can switch from us to the slides quickly. So it's Yeah. You know how to switch. Yeah. Right. That's what I wanted you to know.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. Hold on a second. I'm gonna get some water.
Yep. Take your time. I'm gonna grab some water as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Looks like we're recording. That's good.
Recording? No, you're live.
Yeah, I've got it going. I should be live. I'm going to double check my YouTube on another screen. Give me just a moment here to make sure we are actually live.
I didn't know we were live, bro. What?
Yeah, I thought we were going to do it live. So,
which is fine. No, that's right. But I didn't know we were live. Right.
Yeah, we should just be starting, which is fine. Yep, I see. We have 5 watching. Oh, nice.
Oh, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, I did announce it in the Discord, and I did announce it on YouTube. There we go.
That's great. Yeah,
we are live.
Okay, we can start.
Yeah, whenever you are ready, sir.
Yeah, okay. So, hello, guys. My name is Modern Atheism. I have a YouTube channel. Feel free to go check it out. And I just made a video about debunking common arguments for the resurrection. And it was a 10-minute video, just going very quickly over that. And today I want to go deeper on the arguments. Right. So, Dark, whenever at any moment, if you want to just jump in, to comment, you can do it, or I will just ask you sometimes,
Yeah,
okay.
Go for it whenever you're ready.
Okay. So here's one of the most common arguments. It's that you hear from apologists, they say if Jesus had not resurrected, right, the Jewish authorities would have shown the body all over Jerusalem, right? They would have displayed the body, and everyone would have known that it was a fake, right? Mm-hmm. But here's one big problem with that. According to biblical scholar Dale Allison, a body can become unrecognizable in just about 3 days. And I don't mean that the body is a skeleton in 3 days, obviously, but I mean that the swelling and the rotting can only in about 3 days or a bit more, it can reach to a point where the face is not easily recognizable. And this is especially becomes even harder when you think about the fact that Jesus would have been beaten. They placed a crown of thorns on his head. He would have had a lot of dry blood on his face, all of that. It would have, it could be that only after a few days, the body would have been so difficult to recognize that if the Jewish authorities actually did that, the Christians would have said, oh, that's probably not Jesus. They just got some other guy who looks similar or find some whatever, they would have been able to deny it probably. And there is something that makes this even worse, is that if you look at what the Gospels say say the disciples actually waited for about a week until they began preaching the resurrection. The Acts, or I don't know, I think Acts, it says that they were waiting for the Holy Spirit to come to them. So actually, they didn't announce the resurrection like the day after they found out, right? So that's another point. And another point one can make here is that this argument assumes that the Jewish authorities at the very beginning, just after they unalived Jesus, they care enough for this new movement that they were saying crazy things, that they care enough about this, that they wanted to, like, shoot it down by showing the body. It could be that they didn't really care that much. They assumed that the movement will die out without Jesus. They assumed, like, okay, we just killed the main guy. This movement will probably die out or whatever. They didn't really care, like, so much as to do and try to refute them. So that's another issue. Yeah.
I've got that was something I wanted to bring up. I have a lot on this part of the topic because this one I hear quite often, that why don't they just produce the body? That would disprove Christianity, but they can't do that. That means because he's resurrected. Yeah. But the argument here assumes, like you said, that the authorities knew where the body was, and the authorities cared enough to produce the body. And
right.
The next step from that is that the preserved body actually existed to produce. That was your first point there. And that the gospel burial narrative is historically accurate. And each of those points is debatable. And I've got so much on that. So first of all, with crucifixion practices, bodies so often weren't recoverable. And this is one of the strongest historical points, because crucifixion was meant to be humiliation plus deterrence and not just an execution. So Apologia has a very good point about this. He talks about this quite a bit, because for crucifixions, bodies were left on the cross for days, and they were scavenged by animals and then thrown into common or mass graves. Bart Ehrman has a take on this. John Dominic Crossan, he's a historical Mr. Jesus scholar. And Martin Hengel, he was a crucifixion historian. So if anybody's more interested in reading more about crucifixions themselves, check those three out. Roman crucifixion was not about respectful burial. It was literally about erasing the dignity of the person. So expecting a neat tomb burial is historically, to put it mildly, atypical. So that alone just will weaken this produce the body argument. But there's so much more. And if I talk too much on this, just say, let's go to the next point, because I've got a lot.
All
right. So Pontius Pilate specifically was brutal and politically unconcerned. So, and you can find this in the sources like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus both talk about him. They both describe Pilate as cruel and provocative towards the Jews, and definitely not inclined to accommodate the Jewish sensitivities. This is in also Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John, he gets all like, oh no, I don't want to upset the Jews. So, so because of this, he would be very unlikely to grant a special burial favor or help the Jewish leaders suppress a new sect of Christianity. That's something that doesn't get talked about. Pilate wasn't trying to keep Jewish leaders happy. Historically, he antagonized them. So this idea that he would have cooperated and handed over the body is entirely speculative, again, at best. Another point, Joseph of Arimathea's burial narrative is only theologically convenient. So this is where historical skepticism comes in. So why does this Sanhedrin member suddenly sympathize with Jesus? We don't see him earlier in the story, if I remember right. So why does Mark, the earliest gospel, give such minimal detail? And why do the later gospels embellish the story? So a typical legendary development pattern, in this case, would be Mark, then Matthew and Luke, and then John. And they are in increasing detail and more apologetic in tone. So the burial story looks exactly like what you would expect if early Christians needed a known tomb for resurrection claims. Now, this isn't proof that it didn't happen, but it does raise a lot of doubt. Now, to your point, you mentioned that bodies decompose relatively quickly, so identification would be really hard. But I would like to add on to that, the climate of the area will accelerate the decay, and trauma from the crucifixion would complicate identification. And let's be honest, ancient forensic standards were just non-existent. So after days in the heat, post-crucifixion trauma, and limited preservation methods, even if the body existed, proving identity would be very difficult. And, okay, I've got too many more points. So so like I said, the authorities might not have cared. It often, the idea that the Jewish authorities would have shown the body assumes that authorities saw Christianity as a threat immediately. But historically, the early Mr. Jesus movement was tiny, and most Jewish sects existed, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and etc. And the Roman priority was to order and taxes, and not to theological disputes. So from Rome's perspective, one executed troublemaker with a small fringe group, they wouldn't justify even a most cursory investigation. So the missing body means resurrection is very weak logic. So even if the tomb existed and the body is missing, we can think of multiple possible explanations. Like, let's think of some natural ones, like the wrong tomb. Like, we just got the wrong tomb, or the body was relocated, or what they had to do in Matthew to try to get ahead of this with apologetics was grave robbery. In Luke, it doesn't talk about that, but it's only in Matthew, I believe, that they have the guards at the tomb. And so the disciples could have just very easily moved the body. So this is a story that was in development over decades. So resurrection is not the default explanation ever. It's the most extraordinary one. And as we know, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if the disciples moved the body, so we don't have to say they were being deceptive. This is just a possibility. So there are two versions: the intentional deception hypothesis, or they were motivated by grief or belief, or they just wanted the movement to survive. Another idea would be the unintentional legend development, which is memory distortion and oral tradition embellishment, and the religious experience reinterpretation. So we know the Gospels aren't independent eyewitness records. They were anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. They were written from minimum 30 to 70 years later. They have contradictions. We don't know who exactly visited the tomb, when, and what they saw. And we don't have a contemporary police report. We have theological narratives decades later. Now, you mentioned the Pentecost timing. So the Pentecost is approximately 50 days after Passover, if I remember right, which is plenty of time for body decay and memory shaping and narrative development. So they could just show the body completely ignores this passage of time. All right, one more, and then we can move on.
Yeah, I think they waited. Sorry, they waited for the Holy Spirit, not Pentecost. I think I made a mistake in the slide. They waited a week, not 50 days.
Okay, they waited. Yeah,
it's still a lot of time.
Yeah. So last one on this. This is an argument from silence fallacy. So the claim boils down to, we don't hear about authorities producing the body, therefore resurrection. But the absence of record is not evidence of the event. And many ancient evidence lack documentation. History is full of things that nobody recorded, and silence doesn't prove any miracles. So even if the tomb were empty, that is still not evidence of resurrection. It's evidence of an empty tomb. And those are very different claims. And that's what I got for that one. So I could talk for another hour, I bet.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So let's move on.
Yeah.
So yeah, another very common apologetic is to appeal to the fact that pre-Pauline creed in 1 Corinthians 15 has been dated by many scholars to be within only a few years after the alleged resurrection happened. And the idea behind this is that it predates Paul, and that Paul must have gotten from the disciples when he went to meet them in Jerusalem, and that was like, I think, 3 years about after 3 years after the resurrection, or something like that. There are some scholars who accept this. Many scholars do accept this, actually. Some scholars dispute this. Like Bart Ehrman says, no, we only know that the creed is pre-Pauline, but we cannot really go as far as to say that it is only within 3 years, a few years from the resurrection. But anyway, the case is that many scholars do agree with that. And the argument is that legends usually don't develop so quickly, right? That's the idea, that it takes like a generation for legends to develop. And well, the response is that is simply false. And a scholar called Robert Price, he gives in his book several examples of some legends that developed early. For example, legends about Sabata Sevi appear early. Legends about Yehuda the Side appear also very early. I'm talking about days, really. And also Della Allison talks in his book, he gives other examples. There are some legends about Alexander the Great that also appeared within the lifetime of Alexander. So legends can totally appear early. And I can tell you about a story from my own life. This is a real story. One day, I got to school. I think I was about 15 or something. I was a teenager. And what people were saying, like there was an urban legend going around, it was that the devil had appeared in a popular disco. And many people were saying that just one day out of nowhere. And it was an urban legend that spread so quickly that there were some newspapers that reported the legend, right? And the devil appears in a disco, right? That didn't took 20 years, 50 years to develop, right? It took one day. Somebody just made that up, and for some reason, just some strange reason, sometimes like weird thing happens. People just started repeating this legend, right? So that's what happens. Yeah, that's
yeah. So it's a very important distinction to point out that early belief is not indicative of a historically true event, and early tradition is not indicative of a reliable eyewitness reporting. So when someone says the pre-Pauline creed in Corinthians 15 shows that it was proclaimed early, what does early mean? Well, early still means decades later. Even with conservative dating times, the crucifixion was approximately 30 CE, and 1 Corinthians was around 53 to 55 CE. So the creed may have been a little earlier, but we don't know how much earlier. So best case scenario, 20 to 25 years after the event. And that's not trivial in an oral culture. 20 years is plenty of time for stories to evolve, especially in emotionally charged religious movements. And again, we have no recordings and no written notes from eyewitnesses, and mostly oral transmission. So oral cultures do produce legends quickly, just like you said. Yeah. So this is well documented anthropologically. So cargo cults form within years, and Marian apparition traditions spread rapidly, and urban legends forming within months, even today. And to your Robert Price point, he mentions that legendary development doesn't require centuries. And some key mechanisms would be things like memory distortion and theological motivation and community identity formation and retelling simplification. Next, Paul himself, and I cannot believe I have to keep saying this, Paul was not an eyewitness. It's so often overlooked. Paul explicitly says he received the tradition. I think in the English, it's, I delivered what I received. So his own experience was visionary, the Damascus Road. So even many Christian scholars would admit that Paul never met the earthly Jesus. So his resurrection encounter is described like a revelation. So the earliest written resurrection testimony comes from someone who explicitly said he wasn't there. So the creed shows belief and not evidence. So the creed tells us what Christians believed and what they preached. Again, just because they preached it, it doesn't independently verify an empty tomb or physical resurrection or any of the historical details. A creed tells us what a community believes and not whether the belief is true. So we'll take a look at the geographic distance, because that matters. Paul was writing from Ephesus to Corinth, which means that the Mediterranean travel was slow and expensive, and most converts couldn't investigate these Jerusalem claims, and information flow relied on authority figures. This creates a credibility vacuum where stories can stabilize unchallenged. Yeah, I agree, Colin. Just so many things about that day, which leads to competing resurrection traditions existed. So any uniform early tradition argument is incredibly weakened by this. So Mark, the Gospel of Mark ends without appearances. So Jesus doesn't show up in the Mark. Just the women, if I recall right, the women flee and tell no one. And that's the end of Mark. So different appearance lists, they show variations in location and witnesses and timing. And that suggests that the tradition was still kind of fluid. It hadn't taken root yet. So, as we know, religious movements frequently start with extraordinary claims. So, if we were to take a look at historical parallels, let's see, Sabbatai Zevi, that messianic movement. I don't know if you're familiar with him. One that most of us are familiar with, the Mormon Golden Plates, or UFO religious movements. And the miracle claims show up in many religions, and they often appear immediately. So rapid belief formation is normal in religious movements, and not evidence of their miracles. And we can go into like psychological factors after trauma, and the idea that legend takes generations claim is so outdated even in scholarship. And like I'd mentioned, the verification infrastructure was very weak. There were no centralized records and limited literacy, and no journalism or fact-checking, and strong social incentives to conform. So even false claims could stabilize. There's a quote I absolutely love, and I think everyone should know it. When legend becomes fact, print the legend. So yeah, history shows that once a compelling story takes hold, people often preserve the story rather than investigate it. So I have to ask, if early belief proves truth, do we accept early miracle claims in Islam or Mormonism or Hindu traditions? Because that would force consistency. Early belief doesn't equal historical accuracy. The earliest written resurrection traditions still come decades later, so from someone who wasn't even an eyewitness, and in a world without reliable verification. So religious movements often develop miracle traditions quickly, so the existence of an early creed tells us Christians believed it and not what happened. And I'm ready to move on. I'll try to keep the rest of them a little shorter.
Yeah, because we have a lot to go.
Yeah, we have a lot to go over, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So this one is very popular. William Lane Craig uses it a lot. Like if you have watched some of his old debates, you always. So he says that the tomb was found empty by a group of women, and they say back then the testimony of women wasn't really appreciated, right? And so this what they say. The argument is that if the evangelist was inventing a story, they wouldn't have invented a story where the women found the tomb. They would have invented a story where the males are the witnesses to that, right? Okay, I think this is a really bad argument, and I don't get why it gets used so often as it does. And I have a lot to say about this. So, first point, anointing a dead body would have been a task for women back then in the culture. So if you are the evangelist and you want to think of a reason, okay, why would people go and check out on the body of Jesus, right? It's not like they wanted to check out, is he okay or something, right? He would have invented, okay, what would be a reason for somebody to go? And he could think, oh, they wanted to anoint the body. And who will have done it? The women. So he will naturally invent a story like this if he wanted to do this. Another point, so that's a big point. Another point is that I think this idea that the testimony of women was not believed, I think is massively exaggerated, right? Like, okay, we have some people back then saying some sexist stuff about women, right? Like Josephus has a quote saying, no, they shouldn't be allowed in court because they say because of brashness or whatever. But I mean, do you really think that, for example, think about cases of rape or whatever? Do you think that if the woman was the only witnesses and she's telling them what a man did to her, like nobody's going to believe her or something? That I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? I don't think it's the case that nobody will ever believe women like ever, right? Or if someone breaks into you, steals something for you from your house, and your wife saw that, and she's telling you, look, I saw it was that kid from that neighbor. You think that the husband is going to be like, no, I don't believe you, you're a woman? Of course
Right.
not, man. Right? They're not going to do that. Even I'll have a good example for it. Josephus uses a woman as his witnesses in his account for the Battle of Galatians, for example. So even he uses the testimony of a woman. And the third point, I think this is also very important. When you think about it, it doesn't even make sense because they're saying that this was not going to convince the reader, right? But the reader is not in a position where he has to believe the women, right? Because they just have the male disciples check right afterwards. So the believeness of the story is not predicated on where you take the testimony of the woman to be true or not, right? You also have Paul's testimony about seeing the risen Jesus. You have the disciples' testimony saying, yeah, we saw the risen Jesus. So if you don't believe the way, you're like, no, I won't believe the woman because I'm sexist or whatever. Doesn't matter. You can believe the men who afterwards they confirm the testimony. So it doesn't make the story more, it doesn't affect the credibility of the story, really. It doesn't really matter, right? Yeah. So anything you want to say there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the only sources we have describing the empty tomb are Christian texts written decades later. We have no Roman record. We don't even have Jewish record. We have no archaeological confirmation and no contemporary eyewitnesses. So we don't have evidence of an empty tomb. We have stories about an empty tomb. And again, I'm going to try to keep these now short because we're going to be here all day.
Colin in the chat just made a good point also. Another point is that the male disciples were hiding in risk because maybe the authorities were going after them, right? So they would have been afraid because they would have been identified as the followers. So the women had less risk and were less afraid to go out, right? Because they weren't after them, for example. That's another good point.
That's a very good point. I could go back into like the crucifixion burial because the earlier points still apply. Like they're not buried in tombs normally and they're frequently exposed, but so it just makes it uncertain. So, but the gospel accounts don't even agree on the details. Bart Ehrman has a really good, he has a lesson that when he teaches his class about the problems, the contradictions in the gospels, like, what are the differences? Like the students have to go through each gospel and write down who went to the tomb and what did they see? And was the stone already rolled away? And was it before sunset or at sunrise or after sunrise? You know, so in Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome. In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In Luke, it's several women. And then John, it's initially just Mary Magdalene. And they saw one young man or one angel or two angels or Mr. Jesus himself. And we don't know if the stone was rolled away or not. We don't know when it came up. And these aren't minor variations. They suggest evolving narrative tradition rather than independent corroboration. At least that's the mainstream historical critical view. So, yeah, the women witnesses, you touched on that really well. The story of this serves a theological purpose. So this is often overlooked, that it could show a reversal of social expectations, women being held up as credible witnesses. And this would also emphasize the faithfulness of female followers and reinforce resurrection proclamation authority. And these ancient religious texts frequently use narrative symbolism. Again, I got 2 more points on this. So archaeology cannot confirm the tomb. There are multiple claimed sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's the main one that people generally would agree. But there's also the Garden Tomb nearby. But neither has a strong historical verification, and both reflect later traditions. So we don't have archaeological confirmation identifying a specific tomb as Mr. Jesus's. And finally, the earliest Gospel Mark is actually pretty ambiguous. So like I said, the original Mark ends at 16:8, where the women flee and they tell no one. There's no resurrection appearance, and the later endings were added. So the earliest gospel account ends without appearances, which suggests the tradition was still developing. And so what always stuck out to me about that is the women ran and told no one. Well, how did they know to write what they saw? If they told no one, how did this happen? And I never could square that.
There is a joke about it. Maybe the women were the ones who wrote the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, there is something like that. Well, wasn't Mary Magdalene supposedly she was rewritten as John at one point because she was his favorite disciple? There was some story about that I heard a long time ago when I was studying. Yeah, I don't know enough about it, but it just ends strangely. But if they wrote it down, then they told somebody. So they told whoever reads the Bible.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, all right.
Okay. So another common point is that the bodily resurrection would have been something unexpected under first century Judaism. So the disciples who had hallucinations, they wouldn't have interpreted the hallucination in this way, or they wouldn't have come to that belief because they didn't really expect something like that to happen, right? This is another common point. They according to apologists, they believe that only in the end times there would have been a general bodily resurrection of everybody, but bodily resurrections wouldn't happen before that. So there are several possible explanations for this. One is what Dale Allison says in his book, is that Jesus could have predicted his own resurrection somehow, or talk about it somehow planted the idea in the minds of the disciples. This is a possibility. And one needs to keep it in mind that by the time that Jesus died, the disciples were no longer traditional Jews. You cannot say they are theologically they believe only what Jews believe. No, at this point they were like members of a cult with Jewish roots. So they could easily have some new theological ideas, right? Such as a bodily resurrection. And there is a counterexample in the gospel themselves, where the gospel mentioned that at some point, some people believe that John the Baptist has resurrected, right? And what this shows is that it's completely plausible for at least some Jews to hold that belief. There are many other examples. Another point that Martyrdom makes about this is that this argument treats Jewish beliefs in the 1st century as a monolithic block, like all the Jews believe the same thing, but this is not true. Some Jews believe some things, and some other Jewish sects believe some other things. There is actually a wide variety of beliefs when it comes to these kind of things. And he says that it will be like saying, oh, this is what Americans think on guns, right? There is no one single thing that is what Americans think about guns. There are divided opinions, right? So it would be the same. And yet another argument there is that maybe they thought that the end times were about to begin. They were soon, right? So Jesus will have been the first of those end times. So this is still, so it's not like, oh, Jesus was some guy who resurrected before the end times. No, Jesus was the guy to inaugurate the end times. There is a strong case to be made that this is actually what Matthew believed, that what many gospel authors believe. They talk that the end times will come with their lifetimes, right, with their generation. So there is no incompatibility here, right? Because what they're saying, and precisely what Matthew says, is that Jesus is the first of the recent ones. In fact, Matthew says that other people in the tombs rose from the dead when Jesus rose, right? So he thinks that the end times have begun, right, in a way. And yet another possibility, there are many possibilities here, is that maybe there was some influence from the Hellenistic culture that surrounded Palestine back then, Judea, in which dying and rising gods like such as Osiris or whatever, they were very common. So this is something called religious syncretism, and it happens all the time, right? So they could have gotten this idea from somewhere else, right? Many options here to express. So I think it's not a good argument, right?
Indeed.
Okay.
So you're right. There's a lot of things that you said that I had prepared as well. Jewish beliefs about resurrections were just not uniform. So Second Temple Judaism was very diverse. So the Pharisees believed in resurrections, but the Sadducees rejected resurrection, and apocalyptic sects like the Qumran, they expected divine intervention soon. So there wasn't one Jewish belief about the resurrection. And some texts already indicate unusual resurrection, resuscitation, or exaltation ideas, like Elisha rising from the dead, and Enoch being taken to heaven, and Daniel 12 anticipating resurrection. So there's a lot of conceptual flexibility in there. And individual resurrections before end time was unusual, we'll say, but not unthinkable. The apologists like to lean hard on this unthinkable idea. So it wasn't standard, but religious innovation happens very frequently, especially when a charismatic leader dies and followers reinterpret their expectations and scriptures are reread through the lens of this crisis. This is historically common in religious movements. And again, Paul's experience looks visionary, not physical. We knew about that. And something that every content creator I know that talks about this knows, bereavement visions are extremely common. This is well documented psychologically. I can get you the source for this, but studies suggest that 30 to 60% of grieving people report sensing or seeing deceased loved ones, often vividly and meaningfully, usually interpreted through cultural expectations. What we experience here in the United States would be different than what we'd experience in India or something like that. So the important nuance to talk about there is that these experiences feel real to the person. So we don't have to think these people are intentionally lying or trying to deceive. Grief hallucinations aren't rare, and in a religious context, they often get interpreted as spiritual encounters. So to your point on the expectation and priming, if Jesus predicted vindication or return, the followers might reinterpret experiences accordingly. Cognitive dissonance resolution kicks in. There's a classic pattern. Leader dies, expectation fails, so belief adapts. So we see this historically in the Millerites. There was something called the Great Disappointment, and the Sabbatai Zevi movement, which I brought up just a little bit ago, and various apocalyptic groups. And group dynamics amplify the religious experience. This is, again, sociologically well documented. Shared expectation reinforces an interpretation, and stories stabilize through retelling. Collective belief strengthens their conviction. Again, this is not deception. It doesn't have to be deception. This is normal human psychology. So the question isn't, would Jews expect resurrection? It's more like, what do humans do when a revered leader dies unexpectedly? And history shows they reinterpret events very quickly. And the last I'll talk about this, Jewish beliefs about the resurrection, they're not uniform. And unusual religious interpretations aren't rare. And our earliest resurrection testimonies, that is Paul, describes what sound like visionary experiences, not a physical encounter. Well-documented grief visions, cultural interpretations about divine vindication and group reinforcement and resurrection belief all becomes psychologically and historically understandable without requiring a literal bodily return.
Yeah, that's right. So we can go to the next one, and this is a very common argument when skeptics make the point that you just said earlier, and they say, okay, this could have been bereavement hallucinations. And the first thing that apologists say is, group appearances, right? We have stories of group appearances. The gospel tell us that Jesus appeared to all the disciples when they were eating fish, and everyone saw him, and they had a dinner party and whatever,
Yeah.
And the idea is that, well, it's not possible that all of them were hallucinating at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So here's my basic response on this is that those stories in the Gospels were invented later, right? I do not think that they are reliable. I do not accept everything that the Gospels claim it is true, and that we must find a naturalistic account for that event. No, I think those specific stories were invented later, and you can see, like you said earlier, we can see that there are contradictions within the stories. For example, Luke places the first appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem, while Matthew places it in Galilee. Mark doesn't even mention the appearances. Some skeptics have said that there is a pattern of legendary development in the Gospels that, as time goes on, you can see how the appearances get more impressive. Like in John, they're getting even more impressive, and Thomas is sticking his finger on the wounds and whatever, right? So I don't agree with these stories. But if I had to agree with that, if I had to say that, okay, if I wasn't allowed to say that those stories were not invented, there are some examples of group hallucinations in history, but I think that's one of the next slides. So I think I can leave it for later, but there are some examples of group experiences where there's a group and they have like a mythical experience, like they're in some kind of trance-like state, like they're all praying together, and they just kind of have a weird experience that maybe not all of them see Jesus, but only a few of them maybe hallucinate, and some others think they can sense Jesus, and one thing leads to another one, and a few decades later, the story being told is that they were eating fish and Jesus appeared to them, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Apologia has something called the minimal witnesses argument. If you don't know that one, I highly recommend it. Basically, he just needs to say, I think it's 2 people have to have had some sort of hallucination or bereavement hallucination or something like that, and to kick off the whole thing. But more specifically to this argument, the argument here by the apologist assumes that the group appearances are historically reliable, and that independent sources can confirm them, and that group experiences can't be visionary or legendary, and that the reporting is actually eyewitness based. And all 4 of those points are contestable. So yeah, I'm gonna skip through some of this. So Paul's 500 witnesses claim is unverifiable in practice. Paul says that you could talk to them because most of whom are still alive, but there are no names, no locations, no records of interviews, and no follow-up attestations. And if we look at the travel reality, so he was writing to the people of Corinth, and Corinth to Jerusalem is about 800 miles by the way the crow flies, right over the Mediterranean Sea. And so travel time from Corinth to Jerusalem is well over 1,000 miles. I think it was 1,300 miles when I looked it up last, which would be costly and slow and dangerous. And most of the converts were not wealthy. So the claim it functions rhetorically as not investigatable. So you can check in this world often meant trust my authority, not conduct an investigation. Let's see.
Yeah.
So to your point, the group appearance stories appear later and grow more concrete. If we look at the chronological pattern, so the earliest source is Paul, and he talks about appearances, but no narrative detail. And then Mark, the earliest gospel, has no resurrection appearances, at least in the original ending. And then Matthew and Luke have limited appearances. And then John, the latest one, has physical touch and eating fish and extended dialogue. And that's textbook legendary development. So the stories get more detailed and physical the later that they're written. And the Gospels are not independent accounts. We all know that. There's 3 retellings of the same story, and which are not independent confirmations. And again, we don't know who wrote them. And group visionary experiences are not impossible. So I hear this a lot, but we can think of like the Marian apparitions again, or UFO sightings, or religious revivals, or collective emotional experiences. These don't require identical hallucinations, just some kind of shared experience and interpretation of it. People don't have to see the same thing to agree on what it was. So even group appearances wouldn't prove a resurrection. You still got visionary experiences and religious ecstasy and story development and theological narrative shaping. So group appearance, not the same thing as a bodily resurrection. And last on this, the burden of proof still matters. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So claims without names or contemporary documentation or independent confirmation don't meet that bar. So many witnesses make a story persuasive, they don't make it provable. Just like Angel here says, objection, hearsay. Exactly.
Okay. Sorry, you done?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, okay, that was here. This is another common example that group hallucination don't ever happen. We don't have any examples of history. And there is this great book that I think is probably the best book on the resurrection. And William Lane Craig also thinks that is the most important book on the resurrection, despite being relatively short, but it is by Dale Allison. And I thought it was such an amazing book. Dale Allison is a Christian, but he's very objective. And I think this book sometimes gives skeptics a lot of ammo. And a unique part about the Allison books is that he gives many examples of group hallucinations from the fields of parapsychology and stuff like that. And that's something that nobody else does. Like I have read some other skeptic books on the resurrection, like Komaneskit's book, Doubting Jesus, What Happened in the Black Flood, is a very good book. I read other books, but no other book does what Allison does, which is to go and actually find a lot of examples of people in groups claiming to have seen some supernatural thing. And there are some examples like some 4 people who saw a dead person walking over a lake. There's also a famous example of or people who live in a haunted house, and the entire family claimed that they were together and they saw the ghost of their grandmother walking or something like that, right? That's another. There are many examples of this. So it is not true that you don't find any examples of groups hallucinations. Other examples that one could point out is miracles such as Fatima and stuff like that. And this works with Protestants who don't believe in Mary. But if you tell that to a Catholic, the Catholic will just say, "Oh no, I think Mary did appear to people." So that example it doesn't work every time. But if your interlocutor is a Protestant, then you can point out that example as well. That's that's probably the most famous example of a group hallucination in history, of how many people claim to have seen the sun dancing, and some people say Mary appeared or whatever, So that's what I wanted to say on it.
Yeah. So this claim sets up a false requirement. So the argument assumes that if resurrection belief exists, there must have been group hallucinations. But historically, belief formation doesn't work that way. A more typical pattern would be something like one or maybe a few influential experiences, and interpretation will spread socially, and then stories will develop. To what I mentioned before, apologia's minimal witnesses, the core idea of that, to be very brief, is that Peter claims an experience and Paul claims an experience. Both of them are influential or had become influential leaders. And so communities form around those testimonies. And from there, oral traditions expand and narrative details will grow and group appearance stories can emerge. That's sociologically ordinary. I did bring about that Paul's own experience sounds visionary, but this is something for all you philosophy nuts. The burden of proof problem is still there. Apologists will sometimes argue, well, you can't explain it naturally, therefore resurrection. But a lack of a complete natural explanation does not grant supernatural confirmation. Historical reasoning deals in probabilities. We don't need a perfect alternative, just a plausible one. The leaders themselves didn't need a perfect agreement. And Peter and Paul disagreed a lot. They disagreed on Gentile inclusion and law observance and community practice, yet both of them affirmed a resurrection belief. And this would suggest that the belief wasn't dependent on the one uniform experience. And the last I want to talk about this is that even if group hallucinations were extremely rare, resurrection is far less probable. This is a Bayesian-style argument between rare psychological phenomena and a violation of known biological processes. Historians typically favor the former. So even uncommon natural explanations are usually more plausible historically than a literal resurrections. You don't need everyone seeing the same thing. You just need trusted people saying they did. And I'm done with that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to go over the next three like real quick because they are
okay. Yep.
So one is that they say hallucinations are rare, right? Basically, they are not that rare. You mentioned the figure 30 to 60%. Paulo Gia, you saw Paulo Gia most recent video. He just he just recently made a video on this, going deeply, responding to inspiring philosophy, and a psychologist who made a book about this, where they went over this point that they're actually more common than you think. There are many figures, but 30% is not it's a very plausible number. So there are other figures like 8% or whatever, but they're still not that rare. Another thing, Gary Habermas responds in this way. They say, hallucinations don't change lives, right? My response to that is that depends on the context, right? Mundane hallucinations may not change lives, but if the hallucinations take place in a religious context, then they can change lives. And there is a poll about Muslims who converted to Christianity, and 25% say that visions and dreams had a very important role, or was the most important role in triggering that conversion, right? So visions can definitely change lives in a religious context. And the last one is, sometimes they ask this question, how come most people who hallucinate don't end up believing that their loved ones have resurrected, right? The Paulo Gia made this point in his most recent video, which is a great video. And the answer is basically is context, right? The reason why a widow who has a bereavement hallucination doesn't believe that her husband has resurrected is because her husband was not an apocalyptic preacher who may have talked about his own resurrection, right? And another very important point is that people back then were much more superstitious and stuff like that, so like people today have an hallucination, but they're rational enough to understand, okay, this is an hallucination, this is not real, right? People in the first century having hallucinations, well, who knows, right? So that's another point. Yeah. So that's all I wanted to say here about hallucinations.
Okay. I'm going to hit just my bullet points on this one, since, again, this is going to be a lot. But so bullet points. So rare doesn't mean impossible. And again, you only need a few experiences to start a movement. But if we look at the context, that matters more than things like the base rates. The disciples weren't random people. They were followers of this mystery Jesus, and they were expecting a divine intervention, and they were experiencing trauma and loss and immersed in religious symbolism. So psychology isn't happening in a vacuum. Grief plus expectation can amplify religious experiences. the social reformation, social reinforcement, multiplies impact. That's how religious movements form. And memory itself is constructive and not photographic. So people will fill in details unconsciously and harmonize stories over time and gain confidence with repetition. Something that I haven't heard, so this is entirely hypothetical, is that things existed then, like opium and wine. So while we don't actually have evidence that it links the disciples to using opium, we do have evidence of them drinking wine. Again, but this is entirely hypothetical. We don't need substances to explain visionary experiences. Grief alone produces them just fine. So you just need, go for it.
Yes, I have heard someone saying that maybe they somehow consumed some bread and there were shrooms on it, and they had a hallucinative property. Maybe that's how the whole thing started.
And again, infinitely more plausible than a literal resurrection, that they just ate something bad. So we're not arguing that they did in fact hallucinate, only that if they did, it could absolutely change their lives. Religious visionary experiences often produce major life changes. Again, Islamic and Hindu and Buddhism and the Marian apparitions and Pentecostal revival experiences, they all can't be objectively true simultaneously, but they can still transform lives. And hallucinations feel real. That's the whole point. So hallucinations aren't experienced as fake. They feel real in the moment, which is why they can influence behavior. And Paul is, again, the strongest example. Even Christian scholars acknowledge that his experience was visionary in character. Conversion psychology is very powerful. Conversion often follows things like emotional crises, identity transition, and community pressure, and personal revelation experiences. This fits really well into early Christianity. And we see historical parallels exist everywhere, like Mormonism and Islam, which is Muhammad's revelations, and various prophetic movements radically changed lives. One literary example I don't hear compared, but I wanted to bring up is A Christmas Carol is a fictional example, but rhetorically very useful. Ebenezer Scrooge, he has intense visionary experiences, and it changes his life completely. So this is just an illustration, not actually evidence. Stories will resonate because we recognize how powerful perceived encounters can be. We just don't present the fiction as historical proof. Let's see. Let's give them. So if life-changing experiences prove truth, then do we accept every religious conversion vision as factual? Because most apologists don't. Let's see. And for loved ones, again, context. We got to look at things in context. Like you said, some people today do interpret experiences supernaturally. Like like if something falls off a shelf, oh, my grandfather's ghost. Like I've heard that people say that they have ghost in their house. Yeah. And as expectation increases, then they're more likely to interpret something as a resurrection. And again, Paul and Peter, authority figures, and resurrection itself was not alien to Jewish thoughts. As you talked about, the Hellenistic people around them had dying and rising gods. And even in scripture, Elijah and Elisha, there were multiple resurrections. And there were already miracles attributed to Mr. Jesus, so why wouldn't he be able to resurrect? If he's God, why not? And then memory and story development and even modern skepticism can change the outcomes. So today we've got medical explanations and psychological frameworks and scientific norms that all ancient audiences lacked those as tools. So the same experience, just different explanatory environment. And the last thing I'll touch on this is a very important logical point. The apologetic assumes that because most modern people don't conclude resurrection, ancient believers wouldn't either. That's called presentism, projecting modern mindset backwards, and historians avoid that. Again, same experience, different culture, different conclusion. Ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on.
Yeah.
Another. By the way, do you think you can add my channel to the description or the title?
Yeah, I'll 100% do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked, like, how come hallucinations stopped after 40 days instead of going on for years and years after, after the event took place? Because they say, well, if there was like a mental problem, like a disease, this could have gone on for years, right? And there are some explanations for that. One that I like is James Foro uses these explanations. He says that there is some kind of mechanism designed to establish which things are authoritative, which parts of the revelation are authoritative, and which parts are not. And what he's getting at is that, okay, we're going to say that at some point they just say, okay, we're going to say that what Jesus spoke to us, he did around 40 days after he died, right? And after that, these are the legitimate visions. And after that, these are not illegitimate, because otherwise anyone can just come and say, yeah, I also saw Jesus, he told me this and that, right? So they want to avoid that. Another thing, Dale Allison says that this was probably invented as well. This only appears in Luke, and the number 40 has a theological significance, literally, and theological significance. So maybe it was not even true, right? It was just invented. Another thing, maybe after 40 days, someone had an hallucination of Jesus going to heaven, the ascension, right? And maybe this causes something in his brain to give him like some kind of sense of closure, right? So he will like see that, and then he will think, okay, now Jesus is gone, his mission is over, and share it with the others, and this will influence them and whatever, right? And they will stop the hallucinations a little bit or something like that, right? Something I will say there.
Yeah. To your point, so religious movements often transition from experience to doctrine. Early Christianity moves very quickly from appearances of Mr. Jesus to preaching about him to organized leadership. This aligns really well with what you just said. Let's see. So you said that the 40 days is very likely a theological and not a historical reporting. A lot of times the word 40 days is used, what some translations say just means many days, but people use 40 because it's theologically appealing, I suppose. It's symbolic narrative structuring rather than any sort of precise chronology. Let's see. What else we haven't talked about? The ascension narrative, it provides closure. So authority will remain diffuse and leadership becomes unstable if appearances continued indefinitely. So ending the appearances allow the Gospels to assume authority. Again, it's sociologically typical. And again, oral traditions, they stabilize their stories very quickly. So 40 days is plenty of time for a narrative to consolidate, especially if they got together and they're like, this is what our story is going to be. Yeah. And knowledge of hallucinations, something we talked about, we keep talking about, is that the knowledge of them were very limited then. Ancient people recognized visions and dreams, and they interpreted them religiously, and they lacked the neurological frameworks. So experiences likely got theological interpretations automatically. And that's not to insult their intelligence. It just reflects the historical context. And even the sources don't show continuous appearances. The New Testament itself shows different accounts and sparse details and no ongoing documented appearances. This would suggest that memory development is the cause rather than an ongoing phenomena. And the earliest sources don't mention 40 days. Paul mentions appearances and gives no time frame. The 40-day detail appears later in Acts, I believe, but Luke Acts, and so the last I'll talk about this is that if the appearances did continue, apologists might argue something else. So, for example, why so many appearances? That sounds suspicious. Well, so the argument can become unfalsifiable. The 40-day period only appears in those later and fit the common biblical symbolic pattern. 40 days may tell us more about theology than actual chronology. And that's what I got for that.
Great.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep these short. I got so much written down. Yeah. I'm cutting out more than half of what I wrote.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another common thing is like, oh, what about the story of the doubting Thomas, right? It says that Thomas touched Jesus, right? And if it was an hallucination, right, you cannot explain that, right? I mean, I have to say that the story is made up, right? It's invented. I don't think this actually happened. And James Foro says that, for example, this story has a clear apologetic intent, like the narrative or the message behind this story is that you should believe without evidence, right? It teaches us about the importance of having faith despite not having seen with your own eyes. It only appears in the latest gospel, right, which is many decades later after the events took place. No other gospel mentions that, right? Yeah, how come nobody thought this was important? So I think it's just a made-up story. Paul doesn't mention it. Doesn't mention it either, right? So yeah.
Yeah, most scholars date John to be about 90 to 100 CE, which is decades after Mr. Jesus' death. And the doubting Thomas, like you said, only appears there. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul, none of them mention it. That implication is the story is part of a later theological development and not an independent eyewitness. The story, like you said, has a clear apologetic purpose. Thomas's doubt, the need for tactile proof, and Jesus reassures him. And that reinforces the faith for skeptics. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. It's a teaching moment, not a historical report. And hallucination objections misframe the whole question. The claim assumes that if it was a hallucination, touch would be impossible. But the story could have been added later precisely to counter skepticism. That's exactly why the tactile element appears. It's literary, not historical. And it's entirely inconsistent with earlier accounts. Again, Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, the list of appearances never mentioned Thomas or touching. You would think somebody would mention that's a very important detail to mention. And it's also a pattern in religious storytelling. Introducing a skeptic who touches the miracle is it's a classic narrative device seen in every religious and literary tradition. Miraculous proof for doubters and reinforcing authority for belief. It's a very subtle way to frame narrative intention is greater than the historical claim. Early followers, the visionary experiences were interpreted within the cultural expectations, and later stories like Thomas may retroject tactile verification to address doubt and not record an actual event. Human memory and storytelling often fill gaps to respond to community needs, and this Thomas's need to touch fits this pattern. So Thomas's touch just tells us about theological messaging and not histories. I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So what about Paul? One argument is Paul's 500, and the power Paul says that 500 people saw Jesus, right? They're like, that's a lot, right? And because it's on Paul, then it's also early, right? So it has a good value as source. Is not so detached from the events. But as Del Allison says, Paul doesn't give us many details on this, and it's a very, very vague story. We don't know where it happened. We don't know who saw him. We don't know did those people who allegedly saw him, had they met him in real life or not? How close were they to see Jesus? Were they able to recognize him, right? So it's just so many things we don't know about this. He doesn't mention any one of the witnesses. For all we know, Paul it could have been the case. What I personally think is the case. Somebody told that to Paul, somebody in the early Christian community, right, in the church, and Paul just believed that, right? It was some kind of urban legend in the early church. Paul believed that, and he repeated what he believed, right? That's my hypothesis on why why does Paul say that. And there is just a lot of stuff that happens. For example, phenomena like Fatima, when many people claim that, oh yeah, we all saw Mary, right? With stories that get exaggerated. For example, again on Fatima, we have many people saying that they saw the sun, and suddenly the story is that everyone saw the sun, right? What they tell is, 70,000 people saw the sun, but we don't know if all of them saw that, right? They just assume that everyone saw it because we have quite a few saying, yeah, I saw it, right? So maybe something like this happened. There was some congregation that got into some trance-like state, some very religious excited state, and somebody scream, "Hey, Jesus is here with us, sharing our love," and somebody says, "Oh my God, I can see it," and then somebody's like, "Oh, I can feel it," and one thing leads to another, and then suddenly the story being told is that they were in church and Jesus appears to them, stuff like that. So I think that's just a legend. And yeah,
Please
okay,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay. So interestingly enough, the idea is 500 is a very round number. So it could very easily be a secondhand or legendary. Oral traditions circulate very rapidly in early Christian communities. We already talked about that. 500 people is very likely rhetorical. It's probably more like a lot of people rather than I counted 500 people. And it could be a story forming device and not actually literal. Even Paul may have been repeating the earliest circulating story and not reporting direct observation. And we talked a lot of what we already talked about applies here, like the minimal witnesses hypothesis. Again, only a few people, Paul, Peter, and maybe James, needed to claim an experience. So from that, stories of larger groups could very easily develop. And early communities trusted them, so narrative would spread very naturally. Let's see. We already discussed that travel and practicality from Corinth to Jerusalem, and that early visions were likely visionary rather than physical, and the Gospels themselves don't consistently report group appearances. And nothing Paul says here independently verifies a mass physical resurrection. It just reflects an early tradition. So to summarize all of this, Paul mentioned 500 witnesses, but we have no independent verification, no names. It could very easily be rhetorical or secondhand, growing from just a few visionary experiences into a larger story. A few eyewitnesses' experience can spawn stories of hundreds. That's exactly how legends form. So we've already covered minimal witnesses and unverifiable claims and visionary versus bodily experiences. So any of you, if you ever hear this, you can take that little short snippet of what I just said, and it shuts the whole thing down.
Yeah, and also a part of this is when he says about the same topic, he says to the readers in Corinth that there are some people who saw him, some of them are still alive, right? And he seems to say like, yeah. So the claim, what apologists say, is like, oh look, he's appealing to living witnesses, so he's telling people that if they want, they can go travel to Jerusalem and verify that by talking to witnesses, right? So he's like inviting people to fact check, right? So if there has been a lie or something, he wouldn't be doing that. That's the argument, right? But like you talk about this earlier, Corinth, the church he was writing to, it was super far from Jerusalem, and it required people to cross the Mediterranean Sea. It was extremely unlikely that they were going to do that, right? I mean, and even like nobody's going to do that just to do some fact checking. And if they do that, what are they going to say? What are they going to do exactly? Are they going to arrive the main? So to ask random people in the street in Jerusalem, hey, did you saw Jesus alive? Were you one of the 500? And if they say no, I didn't see him. I mean, what if that's supposed to prove? It just means you didn't find one of the 500, right? I mean, I don't see how the logic is supposed to work there. Like, how exactly are you going to verify that? Are you going to go and ask everyone in Jerusalem and then be like, okay, oh look, no, this didn't happen? No, of course not. In practice, there will have been no real way to verify any of that or to do any fact checking.
I agree. And one thing that I haven't heard anybody use, and I just looked it up. If we look at the linguistic landscape of first century Jerusalem, Aramaic is what they spoke. It was the primary daily spoken language for most Jewish inhabitants. Although Greek was used as a lingua franca for business and travel and communication with Roman officials, many inhabitants, particularly in urban areas like Jerusalem, were bilingual in Aramaic and Greek. So, but did people in Corinth speak Aramaic, or did they speak Hebrew? Or like, how are they going to verify the story? There needs to be some form of communication. Again, it's not a super strong point that even if you make the 800, by the way the crow flies, or 1,300 mile trip, you've got money, so whatever. Why do you care at that point? You're already doing fine. So, and Latin was used by the Roman administration and by the Roman military. So you've got all these different languages. And so communication on a religious idea is likely going to be used, is likely less to be in Hebrew or Aramaic rather than Greek. And so, in smaller areas, maybe they weren't bilingual. So we know that Matthew didn't understand Aramaic. He couldn't read Aramaic. We knew that because he mistranslates quite a bit. And that's, I was watching Deconstruction Zone talk a lot about that. So they could just very easily be translation issues alone. And there we go. We've got a whole nother problem that I don't hear brought up. Other than that, we've already talked a lot about this. Paul tells the readers they can verify the witnesses, but practically, it's too far. Very few would actually check. And this reinforces that his claim functions rhetorically rather than actually verifiable evidence. Who are they going to go find? One of the 500? Who? Name one of them. It's not written down. We don't know. It's basically a lot of people goes. You could go talk to them yourself. Just find one of 500 people in Jerusalem. You'll find them. Sure. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I go for it.
Yeah. No, that's true. Like you say, hey, that was a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Right? People in Jerusalem would have spoken a different language. This would have been an additional hurdle or barrier to overcome. You also had to maybe find an interpreter, maybe deal with some translation issues. Maybe that will dissuade you from going there because you will be like, I cannot speak the local language anywhere, right? So yeah, I hadn't thought of that point. That's a good point, even if it's not strong by itself, but it adds to the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we think about this a little more modern time, so if we say about 1,000 miles, that's the difference from, and not saying this is just in Europe. That's the difference from like the middle of France to the middle of Germany. And I don't know if a lot of people in Germany speak French, and I don't know if a lot of people in France speak German. And so like the middle of those two countries. So that's about that's 1,000 kilometers. So that's not even 800 miles. So the amount of languages from where you are, if you're in Europe or Asia, go look 1,000 miles in any direction and see if they speak the same language. It's very unlikely that 1,000 miles away from you, they're going to speak the same language you do. It's just less likely. I mean, I guess if you're in Russia, you're going to speak Russian, but I don't know. This is an interesting idea. I don't hear that brought up because it's not impossible. So it's not a super strong point, but it is an interesting thing to think about. Yeah.
So, another point is Paul's conversion. And they made a big deal out of it. They say, he was an enemy of Christianity. And he converted. Like, how could you possibly explain it, right? Unless everything Christianity says is true. Like, it's like impossible to explain, right? And it's even one of the minimal facts of Gary Habermas. We will get to that later, but Mike Licona also uses it as an important fact that apparently is just super hard to explain, right? And well, the first point to be made here is that Paul doesn't even say that he saw the bodily Jesus, right? Like the way Paul narrates the whole thing, it does seem a lot like a mental kind of thing. Like he doesn't say that Jesus walked towards him and begin talking to him or something. He's like he was on a horse, then he saw a bright light, he fell, and then he saw Jesus ask him, Saul, why do you persecute me? Or something like that. So that sounds a lot like a vision. Another point there is that according to Acts, we even have a contradiction in the story. There was one part where he says that the people who were with Paul, they didn't hear Jesus. So one part, I don't remember well, but one part says that they heard something but didn't see anything. And they think there's another part that says that they saw something but didn't hear anything, right? Or the other way around, whatever. The point is that
Yep.
even even Acts itself, there's a contradiction on the story. And Luke, the author of Acts, he has a well-known tendency to contradict Paul on other parts. So Richard Carey and others, and Bart Ehrman and other skeptics have pointed out to many contradictions between what Acts says about Paul and what Paul himself says in his epistles. So the point is that Luke may not even be, how do you say, not being reliable when he narrates what Paul said. So maybe he was changing things. Maybe he just modifying the story. I don't know. There is a part of the story that says that Paul was blinded for 3 days or something. I mean, maybe Luke added that part. Maybe it was a legend. I don't know. So I think Paul just had an hallucination, right? But then what the next point they're going to make, the apologists are like, okay, but why would Paul have an hallucination, right? And I think it will be something like some people have said, like he had feeling a lot of guilt over his actions. He was persecuting Christians and unaliving them and all of that. Maybe he was inwardly feeling guilty about this, and the stress he was feeling, somehow triggering a hallucination. Maybe he was just spending so much time thinking about Christianity that his brain somehow ended up causing a hallucination. Apologists usually say, like, but why would an enemy of Christianity, a persecutor, hallucinate Jesus? And I don't see the problem, right? If anything, it will be more difficult to explain why somebody who has never heard of Christianity, right, who has barely heard of Christianity, who considers it to be super unimportant, it will be difficult to explain what that person has an hallucination of Jesus. But somebody like Paul, who is constantly thinking about Christianity in his brain, going over, listening to Christian claims, and who has a lot to do with that. I mean, it could perfectly happen. I don't see like the big issue there, right?
Yeah. Yep. Again, we talked a lot about this already. There is something that I'm going to bring up. I was advised against this by a friend of mine, but I have heard there's speculation that Paul may have had something like schizophrenia. Now,
yeah,
to be fair, we don't know for sure. But that would explain a number of things, or especially that if he fell and hit his head, and like that could very easily cause things like temporary sensory impairment. And so like visionary experiences are very common under stress and grief and expectation. He knew about these things. So sudden intense experiences sometimes produce temporary physical effects or visions. There's nothing unusual about that historically or psychologically. To put a bow on this part, Paul's Damascus Road encounter is reported only by him. Again, like you said, I believe you are correct that the people did not see anything. No, they didn't hear anything. They saw a light, but they didn't hear anything. So, which would make this exactly the kind of solitary vision experience we would expect. A sudden, startling event could explain the experience and any temporary sensory effects, all interpreted through his religious expectations. This is historically and psychologically plausible without invoking anything supernatural, especially not a resurrection. Powerful personal experiences feel real, and that's enough to inspire conviction, even if no one else sees anything. And again, this is entirely consistent with the minimal witnesses model. Only a few early experiences are needed to see the resurrection narrative. Paul's experience alone could have been enough to influence early Christian communities, given his authority. And so, again, and it was highly charged religious context. These visions are very likely to be interpreted as meaningful. And so, again, there's nothing supernatural that needs to be invoked on this one.
Yeah. I'm just so another I wanted to ask ChatGPT about, if there is a counter example of someone who was an opponent of Christianity and later had a vision and converted. And ChatGPT said there was a guy called Saul Aniski that it's like an example of a person who was strongly opposed to Christianity but later ended up converting. So these kind of things can happen, right?
Sure, yeah, it's not uncommon. And plus, you get modern apologists like, who am I talking? Not Gary Habermas. Who wrote the case for Lee Strobel? Lee Strobel claims that he was a fundamental, like a hardcore atheist, whatever that actually means. And then he had a very fairly sudden conversion when he, quote unquote, investigated it. And then suddenly he's Christian and devout and writing books about being a Christian. So it's not at all uncommon for someone to convert from atheism or from even another religion to like a contradictory religion to a form of Christianity. It's entirely within the realm of naturalism.
Yeah. So another example is James. The claim is that James was a skeptic, and he was also convinced by an appearance of Jesus. This is another minimal fact. This is another one of Gary Habermas' minimal facts. But I think this is the weakest one, probably, because the justification for the fact that James was a skeptic is very weak. It's based on one single verse in Matthew, I think. There's one verse that says that Mary and his brothers and sisters thought that Jesus was crazy, right? And did not believe in him. That's all. One single verse says that. It doesn't even mention James. And they go to say, okay, so James was like a skeptic. They use the word skeptic like he meant the same of today, what modern skeptic, what the word means is different, right? James was a Jew, right? So you worded as, James was a Jew, got convinced. That sounds less impressive, right? Because remember, when you hear skeptic, it's not the same as you and I, for example. So we don't know when James changed his mind. We don't know if it was as a result of the resurrection. Maybe he changed his mind at some point during Jesus' ministry, right? If he changed his mind at all, because the verse doesn't say that the totality of brothers and sisters of Jesus believed he was crazy, right? It only mentions Mary and the brothers and sisters of Jesus. And even then, I find this verse unrealistic because Mary allegedly knew about the virgin birth. She had an angel come to her and tell her that Jesus was the Son of God and all of that. So why would she later not believe him? It doesn't make sense at all when you think about it. It doesn't match with the rest of the infancy narratives, for example. So that's another problem with that.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about it a little later, but I know that there was Mr. Jesus couldn't perform miraculous works in Jerusalem because it was justified away by the people.
Galilee. In Galilee.
It was in Galilee. Thank you. Yep. His hometown. That's right. I don't know why I said Jerusalem, but but he could do no works there because the Bible says it. But why couldn't he actually do good works there? Is it possibly because people there knew who he was, and so he couldn't BS them, for lack of a better term? But specifically for this aspect of it, I'm going to, again, try to keep this short. James was part of Mr. Jesus's family and community, so influence from siblings and social pressure or shared expectations could very easily explain his conversion. Conversion doesn't require a miraculous appearance. Only things like perceived authority or persuasiveness of the movement itself. So James may have been convinced by community dynamics. Nothing supernatural is needed for that kind of thing. And like we talked about, conversion to other religions was very common. Early first century Judea and surrounding regions had various messianic movements and religious sects. So conversions to other groups like the Essenes and John the Baptist followers and Hellenistic mystery religions were very well documented. So being persuaded to join a movement is historically unremarkable. People converted to many religious movements back then. It doesn't make any of them historically miraculous. To keep this, there's a psychological angle I wanted to bring up. It's a little tough, but humans tend to reinterpret prior skepticism after joining the new community. So this can make it feel as though they were convinced by a miraculous encounter, even if no such encounter actually happened. Psychological and social factors can make conversions feel like proof of an event. But again, feeling convinced is not the same as evidence of the event itself. And somebody converting doesn't make it true. It means that that person was convinced. And that's all I got for that one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the next one. Oh, this is super common, right? All the disciples were martyred, or they believe in the resurrection, right? Who will die for a lie, right? We have all heard of this.
Yeah.
So, well, those stories about the disciples dying for a lie, most of them are legends. Actually, they are not reliable history. For example, if you look at the Philip, for example, the Acts of Philip is where this story, where they talk about the martyrdom of Philip. And you know what happens when Philip is in the cross? He curses the people who punish him, and in punishment for that, Jesus appears to him, and he says that he shouldn't cross his enemy. And then the earth appears and swallows all of these thousands of people. And then Philip is told that he will be admitted to heaven, but only after he spends 40 days being tormented or something like that. It's very crazy stuff. The acts of Andrew. Oh, sorry, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fine. Please continue. There are a lot of different accounts. Then all of them are decades or centuries after the execution supposedly happened. So, but please go on. I want to know more about what you have to say.
Yeah, there are many centuries. The Acts of Andrew, again, he has so many miracles. He has a talking leopard, a talking goat. He has so many crazy stuff. And this is the source, the early source for the martyrdom. These are very legendary. There are not decades, there are centuries after the facts happened, right? We only have, I think, Peter, is like decades after. Some people say, maybe Peter got martyred. Or James which appears in Acts, James the sort of 70 or something like that. But most of them are legends, right? So,
many of the accounts, like I said, it happened later. You can even look to Papias and Eusebius. That's where more of these accounts happen. So again, decades or centuries later. And also the Acts of Peter, like some of these stories aren't canon. They're apocrypha. They're part of the apocrypha. So like if they're true, but we're not going to put in the Bible because they're not congruent with what we want the Bible to say. Like if it's true and inspired by God, why isn't it in the Bible? Although some religions I hear do have some of those, like the different number of books in the Bible are different from Catholic and Protestant, and actually, okay. I'm sorry, please continue.
Yeah, okay. So what they say next is, okay, but at least we know that the disciples were willing to die for a lie. And we know this from Acts. That Acts tell us that there was a lot of persecution, against Christians in the early first century, right? So at least the argument is, okay, at least this shows that they were willing to risk that, right? And what I would say to this is, well, skeptics don't really grant the historicity of Acts. My own opinion, I think a lot of this persecution story of Acts has been exaggerated, right? And this is just Christian propaganda designed to make the Jews look bad and make the Christians look good and law-abiding by comparison. And there is a skeptic called Candida Moss, and she has written an entire book called The Myth of Persecution, which goes about how all of these stories, all of this argument of there was this massive persecution at the beginning, it is very exaggerated. It is not really true. There's a lot of legend, a lot of exaggeration on it. The point that she makes is that while it is true that early Christians faced some persecution at the beginning, it wasn't nearly that like super strong, right? Apology also says that Christians actually lived relatively peaceful lives at least early. Later on, with Nero, who started in the year 60 or so, who started persecuting them. Okay, then it was bad. At that point, I agree, it was bad. It was in Rome, but it was only localized. It was only there only a few years, and it wasn't. But that was 30 years after the movement had already begun, right? By that point, many of the disciples will have been dead, and many of them will have been like not around anymore, or in other countries or whatever, right? So, I mean, what I'm saying is that at the very beginning, the years when they started preaching, the persecution wasn't really that bad as Christians say.
Yeah, Apology even brings up that even if we grant the point that every disciple was executed for their belief, we don't know things like whether they had the chance to recant their belief, or whether the reason was the belief in the resurrection or something like a political rebellion, or whether the story itself has been shaped to serve a theological point. We don't have reliable evidence that any of them actually died specifically because they believe Mr. Jesus rose from the dead. And one thing, when I talk about this with a lot of my followers in my videos, when people like to bring up that nobody would die for a lie, people will die for a lie or false beliefs. People, like, human psychology shows that people die for causes they sincerely believe in, whether they're true or false. And so if you guys hear this, something I like to bring up is that spies or soldiers will die for misinformation, and cult members will die for apocalyptic prophecies, and religious martyrs from many traditions. Dying for a belief does not in any way confirm its truth. It only shows conviction. But even then, the earliest martyr evidence, like Stephen in Acts, is narrative and not independently verified history. The rest, like Peter, James, the others, comes from those later Christian tradition. Almost all of the martyrdom stories come decades later and were written in a context that encouraged heroic legends. Again, dying for a belief proves commitment, not the actual reality of it. Again, I'm going to keep these as short as I can. So let's go to the next one, unless you have something to add.
Yeah. So another thing they say is where there was no motivation for the disciples to lie about that. But I think, there would have obviously been some gain from being the one of the leaders of a popular cult of a religion. In fact, I think Luke at some point has a verse telling us that there were women and people who gave money to Jesus to the disciples and to Jesus in support of their ministry, right? So it specifically telling us that people gave them money in support, like all cults, like it happens to all cults. People help them out. So you have a lot of people, and they give a little bit. Guess what? At some point, you actually make a lot of money, right? So and you have like power and authority. That's something that you kind of enjoy. So you cannot say, okay, there will have been absolutely no motivation for lying about this, right?
Yeah, even if we grant sincere belief, there are still plenty of reasons why a resurrection story could spread. And what I had written down for this is like prestige and influence within the group itself, like internally to the cult or within the movement leadership, and then political leverage or protection within that community. There's also social cohesion, like a shared belief, which will strengthen your group's identity. And something that I don't often hear about is the psychological need, like that is confirming that their leader was divine will validate all of their sacrifices. Again, you get into the sunk cost fallacy with those kinds of things. But people gain social and psychological rewards from promoting beliefs even without objective truth. But they might not even intentionally be lying. Memory is constructive, like I talked about before. Over time, people will fill in gaps and exaggerate and reinterpret experiences. So I was told that when you remember something, when you tell a story, you're not remembering the event, you're remembering the last time you told the story. So So these visionary experiences could be interpreted as literal events, even if they were subjective. This creates honest belief while still producing a false narrative. They may have sincerely believed that Mr. Jesus rose, but again, sincere belief doesn't say it happened. Let's see. Social and cultural pressures could turn personal conviction to a widespread story, independent of historical reality. Again, even if they weren't deliberately lying, there were plenty of reasons to believe or even embellish the resurrection story, like social influence, psychological need, and cultural expectation. It's one of the worst talking points. No motivation to lie. There's, again, if people will die for a lie, there's a lot of motivation for the disciples to lie. Let's move on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, on top of that, like you said, well, most skeptics aren't really proposing that the disciples got together and made up a lie about this Jesus resurrected, right? They said the hypothesis is that because of some hallucinations or cognitive dissonance or whatever, they did have some kind of honest belief that Jesus had resurrected, right? They did believe in some form that Jesus was divine and their leader had risen from the dead, and they were preaching that, right? From like honestly. Okay. So let's move on to the next one. So one argument for the gospel is that the gospels contain many correct historical details. For example, the names of real places, like cities, like Bethsaida or Galilee or whatever. The names of people like Pilate, of real people, stuff like that. It will be like, oh, like this is confirmed, right? But so this proves that this says they're reliable, right? But you may have heard something called the Spider-Man analogy, and the idea is that, well, just because the comics of Spider-Man mention New York City, he doesn't mean that the whole story is real, right? And there's a trivial general knowledge stuff that anyone back then would have had and would have been able to include in the stories or narrations, right? It doesn't prove enough. It doesn't do anything to prove that the events, especially the miraculous events, that this actually took place, right?
Exactly. So the Gospels do contain geographical names and common customs and social details, and they are verifiable and mundane. Like Judea had Roman governors, or people paid taxes in the temple. So I can grant this is a Hitchens quote that I absolutely love. We can grant every single mundane claim in the Bible, every single one of them. We can even grant that a guy named Mr. Jesus existed and that he walked around Judea, and you're still no more closer to showing anything supernatural actually happened. But to move on to the next point about it, the Gospels also contain mistakes. There are contradictions about chronology and numbers and events, like the genealogical differences and the resurrection details. And the historical accuracy is inconsistent. So even some of the mundane claims are not uniformly correct. Just like if we look at what the apologist here says, it says the Gospels contain many correct historical details. Not everything is historically correct. So again, we can concede every single mundane accuracy, but yeah, there are trivial historical details are right, but the resurrection is the apologist is saying, yes, the trivial historical details are right, so the resurrection is also likely, and that's a logical fallacy. The truth of minor claims does not mean the truth of miraculous claims. Matt Dillahunty had a long time ago if I have a book and 9 things of it are absolutely true, what does that tell you about the 10th thing? It tells you nothing about whether the 10th thing is true. Yep. I'm going to put this up on screen. Yeah, Steve, shouldn't they know what year Mr. Jesus was born if the Bible is correct in detail? Or what day was he? Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah. Like you say, there are also many mistakes. Like, Some skeptics say that Mark has many geography mistakes, for example, and also
Mhm.
there are tons of contradiction and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's also something to keep in mind. Yeah. So another argument is that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, right? Like Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They would say Mark was the interpreter of Peter. Luke was a companion of Paul, and he was interviewing eyewitnesses. Matthew was an eyewitness, a direct eyewitness, and John was also an eyewitness. But most, by the majority of scholars, don't agree with that. Biblical scholars do not think that the Gospels go back to were written by eyewitnesses. They say that the Gospels originally circulated anonymous, and the names of the Gospels, the attributions of that, they were attached in the late second century. Actually, the earliest we see when we actually see people start talking about, okay, who wrote Mark, the names Mark, Matthew, Luke, is about the year 180 AD, which is really late. It's many years after they were allegedly written, and many years after the events took place. So it's like there is this 100-year gap or something where nobody knows, right, who the authors are, and it's very weird because there are church fathers that quote the Gospels and talk about the Gospels, but they refer to them as the memoirs of the disciples, or the Gospel of Lord Jesus, or stuff like that. And this is very strange. If they knew the title, why don't they mention, like, yeah, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew? They don't mention this. It's only in many years later when people start saying that, right? Another point about this, Butterman makes this case a lot, is that the disciples would have never been able to write a document like that, because Matthew, for example, or John, they couldn't. They were peasants from Judea. They would have never been able to write a document in Greek, in fluent Greek, with this level of, literal complexity, or richness. The idea is that you look at Matthew and you see that a highly educated Hellenistic Jew must have written this. Someone who came from later, from Jerusalem or wherever, from the diaspora, and knew Greek and was highly educated. And that's not the profile of Matthew or John. John was a fisherman and stuff like that. It just doesn't match. So Bart Ehrman makes this point a lot. And if you want to look more, there was a great debate between Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman on this Antiquum on Licona's channel. So it's a very good watch if you're interested in that.
Yep, I agree with you 100%. The church fathers and the memoirs are all secondary. So the mentions by the church fathers, like Papias and Irenaeus, etc., they all appear decades or more than a century later. So these are just references to traditions or memoirs, not any kind of firsthand evidence. And one thing that I want, and we can wrap this part up. One thing I bring up a lot in this kind of things, this is one of the reasons why I would consider myself a mythicist. One thing that I believe we need to show that someone existed is something contemporary written from the person's lifetime about them. So we have coins from with Julius Caesar's face on it. We have written accounts about Alexander the Great from enemies and allies, or at least references to him. And one thing, these people, the disciples, they knew that Mr. Jesus was a incredibly historically significant person. He was literally the most important person to have ever lived and who will have ever lived. So you would think someone would go, oh yeah, there's a guy named Mr. Jesus, and he says this while he was alive. We would expect letters or sayings or documents referencing him at the time. there were literate people in that area. They were historians. They were record keepers in this region. But we get nothing until 2 to 3 decades later, anything. So even by the standards of time, there is a striking absence of contemporary records about Mr. Jesus's words or deeds. So again, he is the most important person and people knew it, but they couldn't be bothered to write down a single thing he said while he was out preaching. And I understand that they were thinking that the apocalypse was coming soon, like the second coming, but that wasn't the first thing taught. So anything could have been written down. And even the people who were those historians that were in the area at the time could have written down, there's a guy named Mr. Jesus and everyone thinks he's super important in this area, so he exists. But again, we literally have an argument from deafening silence on that regard. So I harp on that. Anyone can use that claim. I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the most powerful positions against a Mr. Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I love that quote. Yeah, Barthelma has a great quote on that. So yeah, only 3 more to go.
Almost there. We got this.
Almost there. Yeah. So by the way, guys, please subscribe to my channel. I want to have more subscribers. So do me that favor. Okay. Anyway, the claim is the undesigned coincidence. It's proof that the Gospels are reliable, right? So if one wants to go deep into that, one will have to look at each undesigned coincidence, right, individually. But we don't have time to do that today. But something I want to say generally is that undesigned coincidences can appear if there is like a common pool of oral tradition, and a gospel author feels free to rewrite or to change some things according to his rhetorical goals, and these other gospel authors also feels free to, take this element or this other element, right? Again, according to his style or whatever. So this can easily cause that there will be some things here in this story that match with this other story, but that's just because they come from the same source, right? So there's nothing really special about that. And if you want to look at good examples, Dan McLaren has some fantastic videos responding to what I think is the strongest undesigned coincidence, which is the ones at the Feeding of the 5,000. And he goes very deep into scholarship. He has a series of videos, I think around 2 months ago or 1 month ago, responding to Wes Huff on this. And they had like a little debate on it, like they went back and forth responding to it. He made like 2 videos and he went super deep on it, on this. I think Richard Carey also has a video in Mid-Vision debunking undesigned coincidence. I think he also has a blog post on his website where he goes one by one, because it's like the best way to actually refute it. But just to give some general words on it, yeah, you can look it up later. There are many resources that deal with this.
Yeah. A common oral tradition explains this overlap just fine. If these multiple authors are drawing from the same oral tradition, coincidences are surprising. They're actually expected. But we know that the authors had theological agendas, and each of the gospel emphasizes different themes. Like Matthew was for Jewish fulfillment, and Luke was about universal salvation, and John was about high Christology. So the authors, they shape their stories to fit those agendas, which makes the overlap look less undesigned and more like literary shaping around those shared traditions. The Gospels aren't neutral reporting. They are theological narratives shaped for their specific audiences. But partial accuracy doesn't validate everything. So many historical works mix fact with embellishment, and something like a grain of truth often underlies these legends. So even if some events did happen, that doesn't validate the supernatural claims. I cannot stress that enough. Getting some of the details right doesn't mean miracles happened. History and legend often mix. When legend becomes fact, print the legend. And coincidences can happen without truth. Independent accounts often overlap accidentally. human memory tends towards narrative coherence, and even fabricated stories usually anchor themselves in some sort of familiar reality. And this is an underrated point. The Gospels contain significant discrepancies. The resurrection narrative, chronology, witnesses, highlighting coincidences while ignoring contradictions is selective. If coincidences prove reliability, contradictions should count against it. You can't have it both ways. So again, shared stories create shared details. That's sociology and not any kind of proof of miracles.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I think the most resurrection debates boil down to is this: the skeptic is going to propose some naturalistic explanations, and then the apologist is going to say, like, okay, but this is unlikely because of this and that, right?
Mhm.
But I think, like, okay, dude, even if I agree with you, even if I grant you that, I mean, I think you have to, if you're going to show that, well, your scenario is unlikely, therefore it must be that a guy actually rose from the dead, right? I think you have to do more than to show that my scenario is unlikely. I think you have to show that my scenario is like completely impossible, because your scenario of a resurrection actually taking place, if anything, that's a priority a million times more unlikely, right? Like, it's like you think that if my hypothesis has some difficulties, then your hypothesis wins by default. And I'm like, what? Dude, no, the prior probability of a man resurrecting from the dead, right? Given what we know, given our background knowledge about the world, right? Given like David Hume considerations again about miracles and all of that, it is just so low that I think almost any naturalistic hypothesis, as long as it seems kind of plausible, I think that's more likely than a resurrection, right? You could give me a crazy naturalistic hypothesis, like Jesus had a secret twin, they found a secret look-alike, right? The disciples ate some hallucinogenic mushrooms, right? As crazy as this scenario sounds, even that seems to me more likely than the resurrection. Like, if it went boiled down to, okay, you either had to pick that or the resurrection, I would still pick that, right? So even there, like, yeah, that's how I see things. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this is something that I don't know. Maybe you've heard of something like this. This is where I like to take one of their arguments and use it against them. So I call it the cumulative case for non-resurrection. So skeptics, we don't need one perfect alternative. And a lot of apologists will like to say, or like to frame this as like, explain exactly what happened or the resurrection wins. But that's not how historical reasoning works at all. History often leaves partial explanations, but not knowing exactly what happened doesn't make the miracle the default, like you said. So apologists will often attack each natural explanation individually, but the probabilities accumulate across possibilities. So, for example, misidentification of the tomb, what we talked about before. The body was moved. We talked about that. Visionary experiences. We talked about that. Legendary development. We talked about that. Narrative invention. We talked about that. We don't need any single one of them to explain everything. We don't compare one natural explanation to resurrection. We compare the entire range of natural possibilities. So, for example, let's just say it could be more than one of those. Let's just say there were visionary experiences and that led to narrative invention and because the body was moved. So like it could be some combination of those three. And that's still, again, infinitely more likely than a bodily resurrection. We have how many, maybe you know this, modern atheism, dead people staying dead. Do we have an overwhelming prior evidence of that being true?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And how many verified resurrections do we have outside of religious claims? Because those don't count.
Well, zero, obviously.
Zero. Yeah, weird. Huh. So that means any natural explanation, even messy or uncertain, thank you, Angel, for this, starts with a much higher prior probability. A complicated natural explanation is still more probable than a violation of everything we know about biology. I know that Forrest Valkai likes to use that aliens came down and they poisoned your coffee so that you would do something and call the show at that time. And that's still more likely than a God told you to do it, the God directed you to do it, because aliens are naturalistic, and naturalistic things are more likely to exist than a supernatural thing. I think Occam has something to say about that. Though, again, I got a billion things I could say about this. Probability versus possibility. Even if we were to say resurrection isn't logically impossibility, logically impossible. We can, if we grant that resurrection is not logically impossible, the probability still matters. The question isn't could it happen, but what is most likely given the actual evidence. And history is messy. Miracles are neat. Reality usually favors messy. And that's all I have to say about that one.
Yeah. There's another thing I wanted to say. I forgot. Let's grant that my scenario is unlikely. Okay. Because if something is unlikely, it may not happen every day, but I only need it to happen like once in all of history, right? So it can happen once in like the thousands of years of history that humanity has been around, right? So it doesn't matter that much.
Given infinite time, everything possible will happen.
Yeah. Given a lot of time, like you can say at some point, something super weird is going to happen, right? That makes people, like, it can happen. If you say, like, given thousands of years of ancient history, what is the odds that at some point, somewhere, something weird is going to happen? And you can say, well, it becomes higher, right?
Yeah, if you roll a 6-sided die, eventually you're going to hit all 6 numbers.
Yeah.
If you roll a 10-sided die, eventually you're going to hit all 10 numbers. Yeah. Thanks. I'm glad you appreciate that, Mr. Jesus. Yeah, if you roll a 1,000,000-sided die with enough rolls, you'll eventually get all 1 million numbers. So, again, anything natural will happen. Anything possible will happen given infinite amount of time.
Yeah. Okay. On the last one, finally.
Yeah.
We've been 2 hours at this. Okay.
Yeah, I expected about that long.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. So is the minimal facts argument, like Gary Habermas says, like most scholars agree with these facts. These facts point to the resurrection, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, to some degree, this is an argument from authority. But I mean, I do think that arguments from authority do have some force. Like we have to distinguish between dialectic and rhetoric. Like logically and dialectically, obviously they have zero force. But rhetorically, there is some force, obviously, to say that, okay, but most people who are scholars in this field, they do believe that. So, I mean, that does have some force. But something I want to say here, and Paulo Gia has said, is first of all, many scholars work for institutions that make them sign a statement of principles that they kind of contradict any Christian doctrine if they want to remain employed, like in those who work in the church, those who work in Christian universities, right? They cannot openly disagree with basic Christian doctrines without getting in trouble. So that's one thing. Another thing, so I would say this is very important for me. Precisely the kind of person that chooses to study something like New Testament studies, biblical studies, something like that. I think that's the kind of person who is very Christian, who is more likely to obviously believe in that, right? We'll have to look at how many skeptic scholars agree with grant this and grant that. And even then, let's grant them his facts. I don't think that his facts really like inevitably point to a resurrection, right? I didn't mention them here because I just went briefly over that. But I have a great video with Richard Carey. I think it's my most popular video at the moment. It was my first interview with Carey when we went over all the minimal facts of Gary Habermas one by one. We went over there with Richard Carey. It lasts about 1.5 hours, and we went super in depth on all of the facts. How do naturalists account for that, right? So how do we account for the fact that people reported having seen Jesus, we think these are some kind of hallucinations combined with normal legendary development, right? So stuff like that. And in fact, there are many Christians that do not agree that the minimal facts approach is the best one. They are called maximalists. And many Christians, like inspiring philosophy, like Testify, Lydia McGrew, for example, is the most popular one. She says that the minimal facts don't really go far enough. Like this is that you need the entire Gospels to really prove the resurrections. And even so, Lydia McGrew herself, who is a Christian apologist, has criticized Gary Habermas very strongly on minimal facts, right? And she has some videos that strongly criticize him. And one of her recent videos, I think it's a great video, is she takes a look at how many scholars actually grant group appearances, for example, because group appearances are not a minimal fact. And it's actually and how is the spread on skeptic scholars, moderate scholars, and conservative scholars. And it turns out when you look at it, more skeptic and even moderate scholars, they do not grant group appearances at all, right? Like most of them don't do this. So that's something to keep in mind, right? And that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah. I just looked it up real quick. I was on Cross-Examine, that's Frank Turek's website, and he has 4 minimal facts, and which he combines some of them. Very, very briefly, the 6, there's 6 that Gary Habermas tends to do now, is that Mr. Jesus died by crucifixion, the disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus, the disciples were transformed, the conversion of James, the conversion of Paul, and the early proclamation. Those are the 6 that I generally see. Do you remember how many you talked about with Mr. Richard Carrier?
Yeah, I think it's basically those, like that the proclamation, that the resurrection, that he died, right? That the disciples reported having seen him, the conversion of Paul, the conversion of James, who was a skeptic. He makes a big deal out of this. I think the fact that the resurrection was proclaimed early, I think that's a minimal fact. And I forget what the 6th one is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I forget, but yeah,
that's okay.
Like that.
Yeah, so on Frank Turek's website, he combines some of them, and he has that Mr. Jesus existed, that he was crucified, that followers believed they saw him afterwards, and that Christianity grew rapidly. But none of those require a miracle. Agreement about basic historical facts doesn't equal agreement about a supernatural explanation. And one thing that I don't think is pointed out enough, and this may be not as strong of an argument, but I think it's worth keeping in your back pocket. The minimal facts list keeps shrinking. Like in his original, Gary Habermas's original work on it, they had like somewhere between 12 and 15 facts. And then they shrunk to 10, and then they shrunk to 8. And now they're 4 to 6. So this suggests that disagreement and refinement is what's happening, not any kind of solid consensus. So if these facts were overwhelmingly clear, this list wouldn't keep shrinking. So the real leap of this is explanatory and not any kind of historical points. So even if we grant all of those facts, that people believe they saw Mr. Jesus and the story spread and the movement grew, this still leaves things like visionary experiences and memory distortion and legend development and social reinforcing and theological storytelling. The minimal facts, they describe the beliefs, not what actually caused those beliefs. And history doesn't normally infer miracles. So historians generally work within naturalistic explanations and avoid supernatural conclusions because they're not testable. Otherwise, every miracle claim in every religion gets equal footing. So if historians accepted miracles as explanations, every religion would be historically confirmed at once. So just like that Hitchens quote, even if we grant all of the minimal facts, every single one of them, you still have all of your work ahead of you to prove the resurrection. You still have to show that the best explanation is resurrection, and that is a massive evidential leap. So again, even if we grant them, it only tells us what early Christians believed, not that a miracle occurred. Historical consensus on basic events doesn't automatically support a supernatural explanation, and scholars' interpretations can reflect theological commitments as well as evidence. To wrap this part up, you brought about an appeal to authority. There is a difference between an appeal to authority and a fallacious appeal to authority. Yeah, there are a lot of people who study the New Testament. Most New Testament scholars are Christians and believe in the majority of the New Testament. But like you said, that could be because they have to pronounce that. They have to, or they lose their job. If you work for the Creation for CARM, that would be Matt Slick's institution, that you have to profess faith. Same thing with Answers in Genesis. You have to profess that everything is true. So do they really believe that? I don't know. I don't know what's in their head, but they have to say that they do. So I don't know. I think that there's enough with the minimal facts that just leaves everything so underwhelming. I don't care. If literally everyone agreed that the minimal facts were true, like everybody in the world, again, you were a leap and a bound and a hop, skip, and a jump and a million miles away from ever getting to resurrection still. Now, anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up? And I'll let you after this promote your channel. But before we do that,
I don't think I have like much else to add about this really.
No. Okay,
like,
no problem.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Modern Atheism, thank you so much for doing this with me. I was very excited to do this, and I wrote again about 200% more than I actually needed for this, but I'm glad you covered a lot of what I had written down as well. At least it shows that we're on the same page. So if people watching this video want to follow you, there is a link in the description, but where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me in YouTube mostly. So I have a channel, and I also do some interviews with Richard Carrier every now and then. I think those are the coolest videos. These are by far the most popular ones, and so you can check them out if you want. Yeah, and please follow me. I appreciate if you click the subscribe button. And yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Yeah, sure. One last question. What are you working on right now? What's next for your channel?
Actually, I'm looking at some people are not gonna like it, but I'm looking at using AI to see if I can make like better videos or faster videos or something like that. I want to change the format of the kind of videos that I do. I'm looking into using AI for that. And some people, when I told some people about it, like, oh no, don't make AI slow. But I think if you use it well, it can make some very nice stuff, right? So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
I don't know a lot about AI. People have brought up ChatGPT a lot to me. I don't know hardly anything about ChatGPT.
Very cool.
Is it? Again,
yeah, I didn't know. I wasn't using it. I began using it like only 1 or a couple of months ago, and I'm super impressed by that. I'm like, wow, this thing. How does that work? You ask him, hey, I have this opinion. Give me a quote from a scholar that I can use to make it to show this. For example, he will find it somehow. And you ask, help me refute this argument. Help me make this image. Also, you can do that for free. I do in the free. I haven't paid it. I'm gonna start paying, but you have some number of images for free, and it can understand what you want and do that. It's so impressive.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, from what I understand, it's a large language model, so it makes predictions based on the information that you give it and the information that it already has. Again, I don't know a lot about it. I only know of a couple AI large language models like Claude I know of, and Grok. But other than that, I don't know about it. I know Rationality Rules used an AI to work on some of his videos. At least it looked like it, and I believe he said something about it. Yeah, Eric Foxy 27. That is a very good point. I'm going to put that on screen. This is what I hear. Double check the quotes it presents because it may invent quotes. One thing. So for those that don't know, I'm a teacher professionally, and one of the first things we do is with a new class is we say use AI, whatever your favorite AI device. Usually it's ChatGPT, to write something, and we usually give them a prompt and then check it, and it's all 100% of the time there's always something wrong. And so, which is why we say don't use ChatGPT to write your papers. Plus, we also have a program that we use to check to see if anybody used AI to write something. It'll tell us like a percentage, Like, what is the likeliness that this is written by a human compared to an AI? And I've only caught like 2-3 people trying to cheat, but more once we do the first lesson about it's going to be wrong, so don't use it. Don't use it to write your papers. You can get it for sources, I suppose, but again, double check them. Once they do that, they get through real quick.
Yeah, that didn't exist back then when I was doing school, like 20 years ago, more that obviously didn't exist. But I imagine like right now, you have to go to school or to college, it will be super used. Like it can do your entire homework right nowadays. The student can just ask me, hey, I have this homework, do it, and bam, it's done. I don't know how teachers are going to to react to. They have to try and get some tools, like you say, some ways to check if it has been made by an AI or a human. But if they are clever, they can just get the AI to give them like the bulk of the paper, and they will just go obviously modify it manually, right? Only the dumb ones are going to just present the one that ChatGPT gave it with. I don't know how teachers are going to do, because nowadays these things can do homework for you.
Yeah, and one last thing on this, and before we wrap up, I've been accused of giving a ChatGPT response, which I don't entirely know what that means. I assume they means that I put something into ChatGPT and just copied and pasted the response.
There is a certain style. Once you use it, you start to recognize it. You start to identify it. There's a certain style to it.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I can believe that. I don't have experience with the large language model, so I couldn't tell you. But which is what I hate about that kind of response. Like, let's pretend that they're right. Let's pretend that you're talking to someone and they're using ChatGPT to respond to you. That is a genetic fallacy. To say you're using ChatGPT, so you must be wrong or something like that. Because what is the source of where you're bringing from is less relevant to the point that's being made. So even if they're using something to respond to your points, respond to the points being made. Nothing else would actually matter in that situation. All right. Okay. So again, Modern Atheism, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Chat, are we cooked? No, that's sure. Chat, thanks for hanging out with me today. And Modern Atheism, go subscribe to Modern Atheism. The link for his channel is in the description. So again, this was a lot of fun, and I hope we can work together soon. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, thanks a lot, everyone. And as always, keep learning.